In this short video, I'm going to cover the new notice periods and prescribed forms that relate to Section 8 and Section 21 notices. These are what has been known in the press recently as eviction notices. I'm going to outline what you need to know following the recent legislation changes. For those of you who might be new to property, there are effectively two main mechanisms that a property owner can use to regain possession of their property from a tenant. These are known as Section 8 and Section 21 notices. There are various reasons under the Housing Act 2004 where a Section 8 notice can be used. The most common reason for a Section 8 notice is usually rent arrears. A Section 21 notice is simply a request for your property back. There are no grounds for the notice and no reason needs to be given. You issue this notice, it has to be upheld in court and the tenant has to leave within a set time frame. Now I thought I'd just give you a very quick modern history lesson, as it were. Before anyone had heard of coronavirus or COVID-19, the notice periods for these eviction notices were set in law in the Housing Act. For Section 8, if your tenant was 8 weeks or 2 months in arrears, you could issue a Section 8 notice requiring them to leave the property. They would have 2 weeks' notice to do that. If they failed to leave, you would have to go back to court to ask for the notice to be enforced. If you wanted your property back for any other reason that was not defined in law under Section 8 of the Housing Act, then you could issue a Section 21 notice. The notice period for this was quite a bit longer at 2 months. But again, once this notice period had expired, the tenant has a legal obligation to leave the property. Then we entered a global pandemic and all the rules of normal life seemed to go out of the window. Towards the end of March, a new piece of legislation called the Coronavirus Act came into force pretty much overnight. This moved the notice periods for all grounds under Section 8 to 3 months. You can see there's a big jump here from 2 weeks to 3 months for rent arrears. It also extended the notice period for Section 21 notices from 2 months to 3 months. Under the Coronavirus Act, this 3-month notice period was meant to be in place until September. At the end of September, the clause in the Act would either expire or the government would review it and see if the time limit needed to be extended. What has happened since is that pressure has been brought to bear on the government, not least from Wales and Scotland, as both devolved governments went ahead and extended notice periods on all grounds to 6 months a good few weeks ago now. Late on Friday evening of the August bank holiday weekend, the government announced it was amending the notice periods for both Section 8 and Section 21 notices to 6 months, and there were no exceptions to this. Therefore, if you've got a tenant in rent arrears with no prospect of them engaging in a repayment plan or any sort of mediation, you first have to wait 2 months for them to be in arrears before you can issue a Section 8 notice. Assuming they then refuse to leave, you'll have to wait another 6 months before you can even apply to the court to have the notice enforced. If you are looking to issue such a notice now, do bear in mind that not only have the notice periods been extended, but the prescribed forms, as they're known, to issue one of these notices has also been updated. I always say it's always best to go to the primary source of information rather than relying on press releases or Facebook posts you might have seen. In this case, it's the government website, and here's a screenshot of the website you need to go to if you are thinking of issuing either a Section 8 or Section 21 notice now. As a further example, this is the actual form you need to complete to issue a Section 21 notice. It's called a Form 6A. It's in a certain format, it has to contain certain wording and specific dates. Always download the most up-to-date version of this form from the government website at the time you want to use it, and use their detailed guidance notes of how to complete the form correctly so that you're issuing the notice in a legal manner. The last thing you want to happen is when you finally do get to a court hearing in 6, maybe 8 months' time, is that the court throws out your eviction notice on the basis of a technicality. For example, you've used an old version of the form, you've stated the wrong expiry date, or you've used the wrong wording somehow. The same is also true for a Section 8 notice. More recently, the government has now announced some exceptions to the 6-month notice period, and various landlords associations are claiming this is a result of much lobbying pressure that they've put on government. If you have a tenant who has an ongoing antisocial behaviour issue and they've been issued with an antisocial behaviour order, which means the bar for this is quite high, then the notice period for them to vacate the property is reduced to 4 weeks. There has been a lot in the press about people in difficult family situations as a result of lockdown, so domestic abuse is another exception and the notice period for this ground reduces to 2 weeks. The government has allowed those tenants with significant rent arrears, and the definition of this is 6 months or more, to be given notice of 4 weeks. This is aimed at people who were already in rent arrears before the coronavirus crisis hit, so their financial difficulties are not linked to COVID-19. If the tenant makes false statements, depending on the nature of that, the notice period for this reason can be anything from 2 to 4 weeks. And finally, if the tenant has breached their right to rent obligations, then the notice period under Section 8 for this breach is reduced to 3 months. Now, I've already pointed you in the direction of the government website. It's entirely possible, and it's not that difficult for you to issue your own Section 8 and Section 21 notices. They do have to be served in a certain way for it to be legal and to be evidenced, however, but the guidance is on the government website of how to do this. In my experience, what tends to happen is that when these notices expire, the tenant refuses to leave voluntarily. At this point, you'll need to go back to court to get the notice enforced. Eventually, you'll probably need to get the bailiffs involved in order to forcibly evict the tenant and enforce the ruling that you can regain possession of your property. If the tenant hasn't left by the time the notice period has expired, at this point I would strongly recommend you engage an eviction legal specialist. In this way, they become a third party between you and the tenant, and it can take away some of the stress. You're not dealing with what could be a violent or abusive tenant by the time it gets to this point. And as their legal specialist, you have reassurance you're not going to get tripped up on a technicality. In summary, at the moment, if you have a tenant that's not paying the rent or is misbehaving in some way, there's actually very little you can do about it. Even if they're in breach of their contract, by law you can't do anything for 6 months. Experts in the property industry state there are likely to be significant backlogs in court hearings once they do reopen again at the end of September, assuming of course this reopening is not delayed for a third time. I do have a few friends who work in the legal sector and they tell me there was already a backlog of cases before the coronavirus crisis hit. I myself was involved in an eviction for rent arrears last year. The whole process took 7 months. Theoretically, if there weren't court delays at that time, then the quickest we could have regained possession of the house was still 5 months. Under the current rules and circumstances, you could very easily be looking at 12 or 18 months before you regain possession of your property. What this does mean is that from the perspective of the property owner, you need the absolutely best financially viable tenants in your property. If you're looking for new tenants now in this post-COVID-19 landscape, you do need to be fully up to speed with all of the changing legislation and also well educated on how to find good tenants and how to vet those tenants appropriately. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's probably only going to get more difficult to find financially viable tenants in the coming months. We've already seen major companies make thousands of people redundant. Bear in mind that furlough comes to an end in October, so it's likely more redundancies will be announced soon. Not to mention the Brexit deadline is looming in December. There is likely to be some economic impact from that too. The silver lining that remains, which you can use to mitigate the risk of tenants being unable or unwilling to pay the rent, is rent protection insurance. Premiums have increased significantly as a result of the coronavirus crisis, but this type of insurance is still available. If you have tenants you're worried about, you can take out insurance on existing tenants, although do bear in mind this insurance won't take effect for 90 days from the date of purchase. If you're looking for new tenants, you can take out this sort of insurance on them as long as they meet certain criteria. If you want to know more about this type of insurance, just drop me an email at info@thepropertymanagementprogram.co.uk. So if you've got any questions on anything I've covered here or any questions about property management issues you're facing more generally, do feel free to drop me an email at info@thepropertyManagementprogramme. If you want to keep up to date with the changing legislation impacting property owners, there are plenty of ways you can do that. I've created a YouTube channel called PMP TV that you can subscribe to. I regularly post short videos, 2 minutes or less, on topics relevant to property management. In terms of what's going on in the private rented sector, we're particularly busy keeping on top of all the changing regulation as a result of the coronavirus crisis. But there is ongoing legislation that's been in the pipeline for some time as well, so I cover all of that too. We've got an open group on Facebook called Investors Circular, which you're more than welcome to join. And I'm on LinkedIn as well, so do feel free to connect with me there too.